The next bill on the calendar for today is House File 4. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 4, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to taxation, proposing an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution by adding a section to Article 10.
There are amendments at the desk. If there is no objection, we will let the author explain the bill before we act on the amendments. I recognize the author from Washington, Representative Johnson W., who will explain the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, members. House File, today I rise in support of House File 4, a bill that puts Minnesota taxpayers first. It's a simple idea. When the state collects more than it needs, the money should be returned to the hardworking men and women who earned it. Far too long, we have seen surplus after surplus pile up in our state coffers. These surpluses don't belong to the government. They belong to the people of Minnesota. House File 4 ensures that when revenues exceed 105% of projected expenditures, that excess is deposited into a newly established Minnesota tax relief account and then returned to taxpayers in the form of refunds or one-time tax reductions. This is about fairness. It's about trust. It's about giving Minnesotans what they deserve, relief from excessive taxation. Our constituents are dealing with rising costs, higher grocery bills, expensive gas, and inflation hitting them from every direction. Meanwhile, the state is spending on one-time items that will eventually shift the burden back on them. This bill ensures that instead of growing government, we give relief to families who need it most. This measure encourages responsible budgeting. It focuses us on, as legislators, to make decisions based on actual needs, not on the temptation of an ever-growing surplus. By focusing on one-time tax reductions rather than expanding permanent programs, we ensure long-term fiscal stability while still providing much-needed relief. But ultimately, this decision belongs to the people of Minnesota. By proposing a constitutional amendment, we give voters the power to decide in the 2026 general election whether they want a government that is accountable and fair to its taxation policies. I trust that they will agree with us that when we take too much, we must give it back. So I ask my colleagues today, do we stand with the hardworking taxpayers of Minnesota, or do we continue to hoard their money while they struggle to make ends meet? Let's do the right thing. Let's pass House File 4 and let the people decide. Thank you.
Representative Johnson offers the following amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Johnson W. moves to amend House File number 4, the second engrossment. The amendment is coded A3.
I recognize the author of the amendment, Representative Johnson, who will explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Amendment 3 provides further clarification on what biennium is used to determine a surplus. Even-numbered years use the next biennium. Odd-numbered years use the current biennium. That is my amendment. Thank you.
Discussion to the amendment. I recognize a member from Anoka, Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And so as I understand the A3 amendment, and actually first I'd ask for a roll call on the A3 amendment.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And as I understand the A3 amendment, we are shifting the biennium that we're focusing on in House File 4 forward one biennium. So I'd first ask if Representative Johnson yield to a question.
Representative Johnson will yield to a question. Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And my first question is, so if we applied your constitutional amendment, I think to make everything easier, let's apply it to the current situation. The underlying bill would have the amendment focusing on which biennium, and we're changing that in this bill to what biennium? Can you be specific? Can you clarify what shift is going on here?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Stevenson, thank you for the question. What this basically amendment does is so that if the forecast that comes in November, in this example, it came in November of 24, so then it would move it forward to the new biennium, which starts now. So basically, if it was a odd one, it would go towards the next biennium.
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Representative Johnson. I think we're on the same page, that the underlying bill would say, the question would be, is there a surplus in the current biennium, the biennium ending June 30, 2025? And under your amendment, we're now going to be looking at the biennium ending June 30, 2027. And I'm going to ask you to yield to another question.
Representative Johnson will yield to another question. Representative Stevenson.
So this presents an interesting point, because in the current biennia, or in the November forecast that came out this last year, there is a projected surplus in the first biennium, the biennium ending on June 30, 2027, but a projected deficit in the tails, the biennium that follows that. So any tax cuts we make in that first biennia are going to make the deficit worse in the second biennia. So my question is, why would we choose to do that? Why would we choose to force ourselves to do that in a situation where there is a surplus in the first biennium and in this case, significant deficit in the tails? Why would we do that?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Stevenson, thank you for the question. My understanding is basically with this bill, it would be 105% of the surplus. This current forecast that I've seen for the upcoming biennium is nowhere near that. So it would not apply in this situation as we go forward.
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And would Representative Johnson yield to an additional question?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That's true, based on the current forecast. The spread between the first biennium surplus and the tails deficit is a little over $6 billion. Okay, we have a projected $500 million surplus in the first biennium, projected $6 billion deficit in the tails. If you shifted that $3 billion to the positive, each one, you would trigger your constitutional amendment while still having a sizable deficit in the tails. So in that situation, wouldn't you agree it would be unwise to cut taxes when we are facing a deficit in the future?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Stevenson, my understanding is we are dealing with a surplus that would not trigger this application here as we deal with the $6 billion deficit that's coming up. So it would not apply in this situation.
Representative Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, but I'm not asking about the current situation. I'm asking about a situation where there wasn't a surplus sufficient to trigger the constitutional amendment, but a deficit in the tails, which could easily happen. Again, the spread here is wide enough that if you just shifted everything $3 billion in one direction, you would be in exactly that circumstance. And I think it goes to the point that this is not a very wise decision. It handcuffs us. And handcuffs in more than one ways. The amendment talks about the tax released fund surplus in a couple of places. And when I look at the underlying bill, that I believe is described in the paragraph being on 1.21. And it says that the tax relief fund surplus should be only used for property income taxpayers in the state through one-time refunds, which will not be taxable to offset the cost of the general fund, so on and so forth, but one-time refunds. So the idea here, and you mentioned this in your remarks a minute ago, Representative Johnson, is that these payments would be one time, not permanent ongoing tax cuts, but one time. And I understand that this bill is a reaction to the way that the last budget was handled. And I am of a recollection that in the last biennium, we passed a $3 billion tax cut, the largest tax cut bill that has ever passed into law in Minnesota. And Madam Speaker, I wonder if Representative Gomez, who chaired the tax committee that biennium, would yield to a question.
Representative Gomez will yield. Representative Stevenson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Gomez, was there any ongoing tax cuts in your tax bill that passed in 2023?
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Representative Stevenson, thanks for asking. So in 2023, we did a number of tax reductions, as you mentioned. Two of the most notable and the largest items on the spreadsheet were a significant cut to the Social Security tax, which means that 80% of seniors receiving Social Security pay no taxes on those benefits. And another was our nation-leading child tax credit. So that's $1,750 per child for families. There's no cap on that. And so those are two really high dollar items that are ongoing permanent tax cuts for Minnesotans, particularly for those families who really are facing the most profound economic challenges in this economy. Low-income seniors and low-income working families. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Representative Stevenson.
Thank you, Representative Gomez. And Madam Speaker, would Representative Johnson yield to a question?
Representative Johnson will yield to a question. Representative Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Johnson, you just heard that we, passed some permanent tax cuts in that biennium, reducing the tax, getting rid of the tax on Social Security for 80% of seniors, creating the nation-leading child tax credit. Under this constitutional amendment, we would not be able to use the funds in the tax relief fund surplus for such ongoing tax cuts, only one-time taxes. So we wouldn't have been able to use those funds to get rid of the tax on Social Security for 80% of seniors, wouldn't have been able to use them to do a child tax credit. Why would we do that?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Stevenson, it's important to remember that if we have a surplus that is big enough to trigger this 105%, there would be billions and billions and billions within that 5% that you could use for whatever purposes you want, whether you want to send it back for tax cuts, that would be up to the legislature to do that. So it's not like it's leaving you with $0. You'd still have billions and billions and billions of dollars to deal with that if you had upcoming things.
Representative Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Johnson. There would be some, but this money would not be available. The money you're setting aside in this constitutional amendment would not be available for any other purpose other than one-time refunds. You couldn't do ongoing tax cuts with the money in this account, which means it would make it more difficult to do the types of tax cuts that were enacted in the last biennium, whether it's the Social Security or the Child Tax Fund. Members, this amendment, I think, makes a bad bill worse. By focusing on the amendment going forward, we are locking our hands in an area that's even less certain. Forecasts are most accurate at the period closest to us. Under the current language of the constitutional amendment, which, by the way, is still bad, we would be locking in projections that are only 6 months away. Under this amendment that Representative Johnson's bringing forward, we would be locking in our Constitution projections that are 2 years and 6 months away, and a lot can happen in 2 years and 6 months. It's a bad amendment, and I encourage a no vote.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just encourage a yes vote for this amendment. Thank you.
The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Go ahead. Gander votes aye.
Gander votes aye. Gordon.
Gordon votes aye.
Gordon votes aye. Kreshaw.
Kresha votes aye.
Kreshaw votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 67 ayes and 67 nays, the amendment does not prevail. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Gomez moves to amend House File number 4, the second engrossment. The amendment is coded A5.
I recognize the author of the amendment, Representative Gomez, who will explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So the A5 amendment amends House File 4 to provide refunds only to those taxpayers who report an income less than $1 million. This amendment takes Representative Johnson at his word, that he is concerned about the cost of living, that he wants to help families who need it the most. Every dollar of a tax refund that you would send to a millionaire out of this under this amendment, or under your bill, your proposed bill, every dollar you send to a millionaire is a dollar less you're sending to somebody else. The amount in the tax relief account is finite. And so all this is doing is saying, hey, we're really focusing this on the families who need it the most, like you said in your opening remarks. Nobody making $1 million in income or a year, or many millions of dollars, or $1 billion of income even, is facing the kind of cost of living challenges that House File 4 purports to seek, to relieve for them. So I would encourage a yes vote on the A5. If we're sending out tax rebate checks to families who need it the most to deal with the cost of living crisis, multimillionaires and billionaires shouldn't be included. Thank you. Madam Speaker, I'd like to request a roll call on this amendment.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Further discussion to the amendment. Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Gomez, I appreciate this amendment, and I too believe that this tax relief should go back to the average taxpayer. Please vote yes.
Further discussion. Representative Gomez. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Gander votes aye.
Gander votes aye. Gordon.
No.
Gordon votes no.
Gordon votes no. Kreshaw.
Grisha. Grisha, go ahead.
Krisha votes no.
Kreshaw votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 101 yeas and 33 nays, the motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Gomez moves to amend House File Number 4. The second and Grossman as amended. The amendment is coded A4.
I recognize the author of the amendment, Representative Gomez, who will explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So again, we're going to be taking Representative Johnson at his word, and that the intent with House File 4 is to help families who need it the most. And so what House File 4 does is it devotes the taxpayer relief account to expanding state tax credits designed to reduce childhood poverty. We talked a little bit earlier about our nation-leading tax credit, child tax credit, but I don't get sick of talking about it. In 2023, we passed it. It's $1,750 per child. It's the highest child tax credit at the state level in the country. There is no cap on the number of kids that you can claim. So that means that, you know, a lot of refundable tax credits for low-income families. If you have above 3 kids, you don't get an extra tax credit for them. That's not the case with the Minnesota tax credit. We also, in 2024, implemented advanced payments for the child tax credit. So what that means is that low-income families can opt in to receiving a periodic check 3 times a year instead of waiting until tax time to get their critical child tax credit. And so House File 4 would just, you know, expand our efforts in this area. I anticipate that, you know, our child tax credit in 2023 will cut childhood poverty by 1/3. This would help us go even further. And so, you know, if we really want to help out the families who need it the most, then we will vote green on the A4. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to request a roll call, please.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Discussion to the amendment. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the amendment, as I too believe that reducing childhood poverty is a priority. But this language is unnecessary because if passed, future legislators would already have the opportunity to do that with this legislation. So vote no, please.
No further discussion to the amendment. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Gander votes nay.
Gander votes no. Gordon.
Gordon votes no.
Gordon votes no. Kreshaw.
Krisha votes no.
Kreshaw votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 67 ayes and 67 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Gomez moves to amend House File Number 4, the second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A6.
I recognize I recognize Representative Howard, who will explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Members, look, this is a really bad bill. It is going to tie the hands of future legislatures and could have serious negative impacts for our kids, for seniors, for families. But if we're going to institute a scheme like this, shouldn't we at least target tax cuts to those Minnesotans, as Representative Johnson said, who are most in need, who need it most? And so this amendment is an attempt to match Representative Johnson's presentation with the bill. And the way it's structured, it currently shuts out hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans, low and middle income Minnesotans, especially renters, from getting a tax cut. So you could be a family renting, earning $50,000 a year and not receive a dime. But if you're Mark Dayton, you're going to get a hefty tax cut. You could be a senior on a fixed income renting. You're not going to get a nickel. But if you're the Pohlad family, you're going to get a boatload of tax cuts. How does that make any sense at all? And so what this amendment would do is direct the tax cuts to Minnesotans who are most struggling in this economy, and that's Minnesota renters. Right now, Madam Speaker, more than 600,000 Minnesotans are cost burdened, paying more than 30% of their income in rent. More than 250,000 Minnesotans are paying more than half of their income in rent. If you're one of these renters, you're one bad break, one missed shift, one time staying home with your kids from facing a housing crisis. And so what this bill, what this amendment would do was direct resources from the surplus to provide tax cuts to our Minnesota renters. In doing so, will help families who are most in need, as Representative Johnson stated, to be stably housed in their homes. So if you want to give a tax cut to Mark Dayton and the Pohlad family while shafting Minnesota renters, vote no on this amendment. But if you want to support Minnesota renters and seniors and provide relief where it's most needed, as Representative Johnson said, please vote yes.
Discussion to...
Roll call, please.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Further discussion to the amendment. I recognize Representative Igo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to encourage a no vote on this amendment. As much as I hate to disagree with my fellow co-chair over there, a lot of what this amendment would be doing is already redundant in state law. We already have millions of dollars in separate accounts that take care of the issue that this amendment's going to be working at. So this money should be left for the future legislature to decide and not hampered in advance, because we have renters tax credits out there as long as we have emergency rental assistance that is already in state law taking care of this issue at hand. So it would just be redundant to put this in the bill today, so I would encourage members to vote no. Thank you.
Further discussion to the amendment. Representative, there is no further discussion to the amendment. The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Gander votes nay.
Gander votes no. Gordon.
Gordon votes no.
Gordon votes no. Kreshaw.
Kresha votes no.
Kreshaw votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 66 ayes and 67 nays, the motion does not pass and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Nor moves to amend House File Number 4. A second of Grossman as amended. The amendment is coded A8.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Knorr.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I don't know if you have been following the news. Right now, Congress is proposing to cut $880 billion, mostly from Medicaid. Members, did you know that 1.3 million Minnesotans rely on Medicaid? Did you know that 1 in 4 Minnesota is covered by Medicaid? Did you know that more than 42% of our children are covered by Medicaid? Members, did you know that Medicaid is the backbone of our healthcare system in the state of Minnesota? To me, seeing those cuts are harmful, they're cruel, they're not humane. Members, as we talk about that, right now, our federal Medicaid percentage is at the lowest, about 51%. Other states, it's about 80%. If this proposal moves forward, our state will be impacted by about $1.5 billion. Let me repeat that, annually, $1.5 billion. That is significant. We cannot rely on Congress. We cannot rely on Trump and Musk to support us. We can rely on our own resources. With this bill amendment that we have, what it will do is, if there's a reduction in the Medicaid, the resource will backfill the Healthcare Access Fund to make sure that the critical support for our nursing homes, for our long-term care, for our children who rely on this program still continues to exist. Members, it's a simple amendment that shows that we are in a big trouble when it comes to Medicaid. In order to support our kids, our seniors, and our communities, this is the right way to support them and make sure that the funds go exactly where it's needed. I ask for your green support for this amendment. Madam Speaker, I request a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Further discussion to the amendment. Representative from Hennepin, Representative Nadeau.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I was thinking that I'd maybe be able to get to an amendment here that I really liked. But, you know, this amendment, members, follows the same trajectory of what we did last session. And Representative Johnson's bill is pretty simple. It's taking one-time surplus dollars and returning it to the people that we overcollected it from. And what this bill is doing, or what this amendment is doing, is basically trying to take one-time money and pretend that we're going to fund formula-funded programs with it, which ultimately puts us in worse predicaments. What makes it worse is that it only deals, I mean, there's so many funding sources. There's TANF, there's special education, child care development block grants, MA, Minnesota Care, advanced premium tax credits. So if all of a sudden the federal government makes a move, which they get to do, we can disagree, and there was a few of us on this side of the aisle that are doing everything we can to make sure that Congress recognizes the importance of our programs. But members, this is not a serious amendment. We need to continue to make life more affordable so that people can afford their insurance. I appreciate the intent, but this is definitely a no vote, members. Thank you.
Further discussion to the amendment. Representative Noor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to ask the author of the bill if he's aware of the federal medical assistance percentage. Does that go up and down? And so will this bill, if it goes down, as we have seen, I just wanted to make sure that if the author of the bill can yield for a question.
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Noor.
So the question is, the FMAP percentage that we get as a state, it keeps on fluctuating. And depending on where we are at this point, we are at the lowest end almost. If that fluctuates, will the resources go to back to the payers of the tax, or will it backfill what we need to make sure that we take care of Medicaid?
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We have to remember that this only deals with large surpluses. And that in that large surplus, there's that 5% before anything gets kicked in from that point on. And that is dealing, again, with billions and billions and billions. And by the time this actually, if voters choose that they want to have their money back, if there's a large surplus in the future, by the time this actually happens, it'll probably even be billions and billions of dollars more because it deals with the budget. So that money is there. The billions and billions and billions will be there because of that 5% before this even kicks in and the money goes back. Thank you.
Representative Noor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Medicaid is a forecasted program. We're getting federal funds up to $12 billion. It's also projected in the next biennium it's going to be $14 billion. So with this bill, we will not have the opportunity to save those dollars for Medicaid, which supports pregnant women, which supports elderly, which supports disabled individuals. So members, it's really important that we prioritize those who need the most. And Medicaid for the seniors and our children and pregnant women is critical for us to have the best healthcare system that we can give it to them. And I ask you to vote green.
The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Gander votes nay.
Gander votes no. Gordon.
Gordon votes no.
Gordon votes no. Creashaw.
Creashaw votes no.
Creashaw votes no.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 67 ayes and 67 nays, the motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Joachim moves to amend House Law number 4. The second engrossment as amended. The amendment is coded A9.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, the author of the amendment, Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to offer the A9 amendment to House File 4, and I'd like to ask for a roll call.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Joachim.
Members, while we passed a very large increase for our schools in the 2023-24 budget cycle, it's hard to turn around 20 years of underfunding. Many of you have heard from your districts that things are still tight. So since we're going to abdicate our authority to spend a surplus and put this language in our state constitution, I thought we would fund one of the largest constitutional requirements, funding for our public schools instead. The A9 amendment will take the surplus that is noted in the underlying bill and give it to the Commissioner of Education, who must add it to the general fund education revenue that is distributed to schools. General education revenue is meant to be the bulk of a district's funding. It's kind of like the batter in the cake. And levies school districts do are supposed to be the icing, the supplements, the extras. But education funding has not kept pace with inflation. Levies have had to supplement the batter. With this amendment, we finally get the proportions right again and hope to provide a little property tax relief along the way. Members, I would ask you for a yes vote on this amendment.
Discussion to the amendment. I recognize the member from Scott, Representative Bakeberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, thank you, Chair Joachim, for bringing this amendment. You are exactly right. School districts are really struggling right now. Two of the districts that I represent are currently in budget cut process as we speak. So I really appreciate this amendment. And what this amendment does is it addresses a key problem with our education funding. And Chair Joachim talked about this. It's an over-reliance on the local property taxes. And we have to over-rely on local property taxes to meet our constitutional obligation. So for those of us that are on education finance, we've had ongoing conversations where we are using the levy sheets to track $3.8 billion in local property taxes for education. So that's all of our local taxpayers across the state, $3.8 billion. School property taxes make up about a third of all the property taxes that are being assessed by other local governments. And local school districts also contribute. This is why in each of our districts we have this wide disparity in funding. So under this amendment, for example, if there was a $500 million surplus, the Commissioner of Education would be directed to increase state aid, increase funding in state aid and spending to buy down that local property tax, which that would be great for our local taxpayers to do that. And we would buy that down. It could be the local option levy. It could be the LOR, the local option revenue. It could be debt service on a building. But all that to be said is that we would increase the state spending. So over the course of that time, to sustain the local property levies, increased state aid would have to follow year after year after year. This amendment puts us on a path on where we would be able to eliminate, $4 billion in levy. But again, it's going to increase some of our spending. But this is a really important piece because, as Chair Joachim said, our local districts are struggling. So we need to figure out a way to increase the revenues so that our school districts don't have to be cutting. But under this amendment, it would be that we are going to increase state spending in order to reduce taxes at the local level. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Speaker, point of order.
State your point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise under House Rules 4.05, and I'm prepared to offer advice.
State your advice.
My advice, Madam Speaker, is, as Representative Bakeberg just said, that this is going to lock the state into, I believe he said, year after year after year, and I'm just implying that it's probably more than 3 years. It would be ad infinitum. So, as we know under Rule 4.05, that is not germane to this to the bill. It is a one-time tax refund that Representative Johnson is bringing, and it's going to happen as we have a surplus. So, I would request that you find my point of order well taken.
I have studied the amendment. I've reviewed the bill. I considered your advice, and I am ruling that the point of order is well taken.
Madam Speaker,
Representative Long.
I appeal the ruling of the Speaker and ask for a roll call.
Representative Long has appealed the ruling of the Speaker. He has requested a roll call. There will be a roll call. Representative Long.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish that you would have allowed for some advice from our side because I think you might have found it informative. So the amendment that was ruled out of order would not require ongoing funding. It would only apply to the one-time surplus in the same way that the underlying constitutional amendment does, and it would assign that money on a one-time basis. A future legislature could decide whether to keep that funding going or not, which was the point that was made, but there is no requirement under the constitutional amendment for that funding to be ongoing. So this is clearly not a violation of 4.05. And I would ask members to vote to overturn the ruling of the Speaker so that we can vote on the underlying amendment. Thank you.
Further advice, Representative Nash.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, my colleague on the other side of the aisle may have missed line 1.4, where it requires work from the Department of Administration long-term ongoing. So therefore, it would create a long-term ongoing budget line item, which would put this out of order. Thank you.
Further advice. The question before the body is, shall the decision of the Speaker stand as a judgment of the House? A yes or a green vote supports the ruling of the Speaker. A no or a red vote goes against the ruling of the Speaker. There will be a roll call. The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Gander votes aye.
Gander votes aye. Gordon. What do you talk about? Gordon. Gordon votes aye. Creshaw.
You're up.
Creature votes aye.
Creshaw votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 67 ayes and 66 nays, it is a judgment of the House that the decision of the Speaker shall stand. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House Law number 4, as amended.
Third reading. Any further discussion? I recognize the member from Todd, Representative Wiener.
Wow, that was quick. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So thank you for bringing this bill forward, Representative Johnson. And I want to share a little bit of a conversation that I had with an individual today, and I think it was very accurate. He said, "What are you working on today, Mike?" And I told him we're going to be discussing this bill, and he said, "Good." He says, "How did you guys go from an $18 billion surplus to a blank $6 billion deficit. He said, if I did this with my budget at home, I wouldn't have a home because you guys would take it from me because I couldn't pay my taxes. But now you're going to raise my taxes to pay for the deficit. What you said, Representative Johnson, was it puts the citizens first. Isn't that what we're supposed to do in government? Is put the citizens first? So when I look at this bill, and it kind of made me think of something else, and I think I've referenced it in the last session, the statistic that says people that win the lottery, a vast majority of them, go bankrupt within 5 years. Here we are in the state of Minnesota. We had an $18 billion surplus, and we wasted it in a lot of sense because now we're looking at a $6 billion deficit. And we've heard comments from the other side. We can't give the citizens back the surplus because it would affect our budget. How tone deaf and elitist do you have to be to make a comment like that? This is the people's money. And they deserve it back. So I thought, well, let's put this in a real world comparison. Let's say you decided to take your wife out for a nice supper. You bring her to a nice steakhouse, and all of a sudden you meet some friends there, and you're feeling pretty generous. You got a few extra dollars in your pocket. So you decide to buy supper for your friends as well. And it gets time to pay the bill, and the waiter brings you the tab, and you look at it and you go, I think that's a little bit more than it should have been. And you're kind of running it through your head, and it's kind of bothering you. And you say something to the wife, and she says, well, let's look at it. So you run through the numbers and you go, yeah, they overcharged me. They took more of my money than they should have. So you go up to the waitress and you say, you know, I know you already ran my card, but you overcharged me. And the waitress says, I'm sorry, but if I gave you that money back, that would put a hole in our budget. We wouldn't be able to operate our business if we just gave everybody their money back that was owed to them. We have to keep it. Would you go back to that bar or restaurant you were stolen from? A one-time surplus spent on the exponential growth of government. And what this bill does is says, let's put it back to the people. If they feel that they can do better with their money than government, then let them decide. I think this is a great bill. I'm glad to support it. And thank you for bringing it forward.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Coulter.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I'd like to take us all back to the not so distant past, January of 2023. We were talking about requiring MMB to include inflation in budget forecasts, and this is what we heard from Republicans. Our job is to provide oversight. We should be encouraging scrutiny, telling us that, quote, you have abdicated your responsibility as the appropriations body. As someone who has a tendency to overextend metaphors, this one was my personal favorite. That we were putting our budget on autopilot. And, quote, autopilot will take you on a ride you don't want to take. Members, that was all just about being honest about the fact that inflation exists in the world. It didn't force us to spend anything or really do anything. So I was trying to think of my own overextended metaphor that I would use for this bill. And I couldn't help but think of the TV show Pinky and the Brain. Now, I'm not normally a fan of making pop culture references on the floor of the House, but bear with me. So if you don't know the show, Pinky and the Brain are genetically engineered lab mice who try to take over the world. In one episode, their plan involves them stealing a submarine. But when they get in, they find the steering wheel is locked and they can only turn right and go in circles. Members, that is exactly what this amendment would do to our budget. It would force us to turn right and go in circles. And maybe someday we'll get where we need to get, but it's going to be pretty darn hard. And for what, exactly? Just to guarantee a $500 check to every income tax filer in Minnesota would require a surplus of over $4.5 billion. And that ain't happening anytime soon. So anyone saying that this is going to mean big money back in the pockets of Minnesotans is just not being honest. And they aren't being honest about who this would really benefit. So the bill refers to property and income taxpayers of this state. But let's be clear. Property taxpayers almost certainly means property owners. That means that people who own will get more, and the 600,000 Minnesotans who rent, who, by the way, are more likely to be seniors and folks with disabilities, will get less. But the thing is, we know that renters do pay property taxes. That's why we have our Minnesota Renters Credit, which I'm proud to say, thanks to my bill from 2023, will be bigger and more automatic starting this year. This bill says they deserve a smaller slice of the pie, if any at all. And we also know that the vast majority of small businesses rent or lease their space. And this would do absolutely nothing for them. Folks, I represent the business that is the largest property taxpayer in the state of Minnesota. So believe me when I tell you they do not need a tax cut. Members, a vote for this bill is a vote for a big tax cut for the Mall of America and not a penny for our small local businesses. So even if you think it's a good idea to lock in spending like this into our Minnesota Constitution, know that what you would be locking in is a boost to big businesses and wealthy homeowners and a naive dream that enough of the scraps will fall off the table to the rest of us. This bill is a gimmick at best, false hope at worst. When Representative Johnson closed out this bill in the Rules Committee, he said something kind of interesting. He said he heard a lot of fear from our side. Yeah, there is a lot of fear out there. And if you aren't hearing it from your neighbors, you're not listening. Minnesotans are afraid of what the chaos and catastrophe we see coming out of Washington every day means for their lives. They're afraid of what the stock market is already doing to their 401ks. They're afraid they won't be able to afford health care when Medicaid gets axed. They're afraid of what will happen to their kids when the Head Start Center closes. They're afraid the veterans in their lives won't get the care they deserve because people are getting fired at the VA. They are terrified, and they have every right to be. This bill will not do a damn thing to actually help these folks.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Speaker.
State your point of order, Representative Koznick.
Madam Speaker, I rise to remind the body to use proper decorum and language.
Further discussion on the bill, Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I've had the opportunity, being on Ways and Means and Taxes, to hear this bill twice. I'd like to thank Representative Johnson for listening to some of the concerns brought up in committee and amending the bill. Unfortunately, the amendments Representative Johnson has added do not address the major concern that I have with this bill. You see, in the past, when we have had deficits in the states, we decide to borrow from our school districts by delaying their payments. Currently, when we pay our schools, the funding that we talked about in the A9 amendment, over a 2-year biennium, by the way, the Department of Education already does this, so the amendment that we had was not in order, but that's passed. So when we provide our districts their funding, we do it in a 90-10 split. So they get 90% of the funding the first year and 10% the second. Which works great now, but when, like I said, when we've had deficits, we've decided, oh, you know what, we want to keep some of that money, delay their shifts. In 2003 to 2005, the state dropped those payments down close to 80-20. Our school districts do usually have small reserve accounts, anywhere from 4% up to 12%. So, they struggled and they adjusted. But in 2010 and 2011, those payments dropped down to 70-30. Then in 2012, they went all the way down to 60-40. And that is when many of your districts had exhausted their reserve funds and had to take out high-interest loans just to pay their bills. Now we have a statute, State Statute 16A.152. I suggest you take a gander at it. That helps to pay back the shift when there is a positive unrestricted general fund balance forecasted. When that is the case, funds are transferred first to the cash flow account, that's our rainy day fund, then into the budget reserve account, our savings. Then funds can be used to pay back any school shifts that exist below the 90-10 shift and then a levy shift below that. While Representative Johnson's House File 4 does put surplus money after it's been designated as surplus, he does refill the budget reserve account, but completely ignores placing funds into the rainy day account and the account that pays back our schools. Now, before Representative Johnson stands up and says we can do that with the 5%, members, we know what inflation's been doing. Our budget, 5%, that would barely cover a cost of living increase. It would barely cover increasing any funding to the school formula in some of the other areas. Wouldn't let us invest in our nursing homes, in our infrastructure. So this leaves us with a maybe. If you feel like it, you could pay back the shift. But if you don't, tough luck. That is not what we want to do, how we want to do business in Minnesota. Our kids deserve better than pocket change when you feel like it. So do folks that depend on that emergency account that we aren't feeling either. So if one of our communities was hit by floods, that reserve account's not going to be there anymore. Farmers hit by bird flu, the emergency account's not there. And members, this bill really does provide corporations and people who pay property taxes, kind of going back to a landed society, a refund ahead of paying back our schools. Please vote no.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Howard. I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Johnson yield to a couple questions?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson, so if we have a married couple living just on Social Security benefits, seniors, and they're renting their home, would they receive a refund or a rebate under House File 4?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative Gomez, that would be up to future legislators that are in place.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So this is a different answer than you gave me in committee, although the language of the bill has not shifted at all. So I'm curious about, because what it says in House File 4 is that it refers to property and income taxpayers.
Are you asking Representative Johnson to yield?
Yes, Madam Speaker, would
Okay.
Representative Johnson yield?
Representative Johnson.
So, Representative Johnson, has your interpretation of the bill that you're bringing forward changed in the time since we heard this in Tax Committee and Ways and Means? Or is there something else going on?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative, when you ask if my opinion has changed, I don't believe my opinion has changed. I still believe it will be the legislature in the future that will decide which direction those tax relief will go. However, if those retired individuals, if I understand you correctly, if they have income or property tax, they would be eligible for refunds depending upon what the legislature decided to do.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Would Representative Johnson continue to yield?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Gomez.
So, Representative Johnson, in the example that I talked about, I'll make sure that you have a chance to listen to me. In the example that we talked about, a married couple living on Social Security. So if you are two people living solely on Social Security benefits, under Minnesota law, you have no income tax liability. And you talked about property tax liability. And so who would be a property tax payer in your estimation? Who has property tax liability?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative, I guess I'd need to a little bit of clarification. Do they own the property or do they rent?
Are you asking Representative Gomez to...
Sorry, Madam Speaker, I'm asking for further clarification.
Representative Gomez will yield. Representative Gomez.
Well, people are telling me around me I have the floor, Madam Speaker, but the example that I used was a couple who rent, and so they do not have direct property tax liability. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So would Representative Johnson yield to a question?
Representative Johnson will yield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson, would this couple who do not own their home and thus have no direct property tax liability, although they pay property taxes through their rent, would they be eligible to receive a rebate?
Representative Johnson. Madam Chair, Representative, as I understand the intent and of the bill, if there is a surplus and the legislature decides to go back and provide refund on the property tax, that would be an opportunity for that credit to go back. I know we covered that earlier, that through property tax refunds, as a result, they are paying property taxes through their rent. We also have to remember the legislature also has freedom to use that 5% leading up to that over 5% to do what they wish if they decide to do the credits that you're talking about.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, so this is good news. This is good news, Representative Johnson. I'm glad that since we last discussed this, that your intent has changed and that you would now allow renters to receive a rebate from the tax relief account should this become law, but that is different than what you've said in every committee stop up until now. So I guess it's sort of, open to interpretation, it sounds like. Madam Speaker, would Representative Johnson yield to another question?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Okay, so Representative Johnson, we can leave the rental part to the side for now. I'm a single parent. If I make $42,000 or so a year, and I file as head of household, and so that's what I use for my standard deduction. I claim the dependent exemption, and I have a child tax credit in that case. Before the child tax credit, my liability is around $800. I can claim a child tax credit, which buys down my liability. My tax liability brings it to zero. So I'm a single mom. I have one kid. I'm making $42,000 a year. Would I get a tax rebate under House File 4?
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The way this bill works, again, if voters choose to put it through, we do have the surplus. The legislature decides to go the direction of tax cuts or rebates as opposed to not property taxes. And you did pay in income tax because the bill, the way it's stated, it'd only go up to the amount that you paid in. So you would be eligible if you paid in income tax.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that was a no. So the single mom doesn't get a tax refund if she has zero tax liability, although she pays taxes in lots of other ways. Okay, how about if I'm, would Representative Johnson, Madam Speaker, continue to yield?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson, okay, so this example, I'm Amazon. I have property in Minnesota. I pay property taxes on it. Would I be eligible for a refund under your proposal?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative, I believe Amendment Amendment 5, which was brought by Representative Gomez, that we passed almost universally, limiting the amount of limiting to $1 million as far as any persons or corporations getting any money.
Representative Gomez.
Would Representative Johnson continue to yield?
Representative Johnson will yield.
Thank
Representative
you, Madam.
Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson, Amazon, I don't know if you've read some headlines. They generally have no income tax liability. I'm not sure if we should, I'm not sure. You're with me? All right. I asked him, but thank you. Amazon has no income tax liability. They don't have $1 million worth of income in the state of Minnesota. They pay property taxes to Shakopee and other places where they have fulfillment centers. Therefore, they're a property taxpayer. Would they be eligible, if they have no income tax liability in Minnesota, for a refund under your bill?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, my understanding of this bill, any corporation or any owner, anybody with income over $1 million would not be eligible for this. I believe that was the amendment.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So as I just clarified, Amazon does not have income tax liability in Minnesota. If they're a property taxpayer with less than $1 million worth of income tax liability in Minnesota, they would be eligible for a refund under House File 4. Would Representative Johnson continue to yield?
Representative Johnson will yield. Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson. Okay, now I'm an out-of-state billionaire. Jeff Bezos. I own a house up north. I don't have income tax liability generally in Minnesota. But I sold my property up north, so I have a capital gain that gets partially portioned to Minnesota. Would I be eligible if I don't have the, if it's not above $1 million, would I be eligible for a refund under this bill?
Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, Representative, we're starting to get into a lot of hypotheticals that upcoming legislators could deal with when and if this ever happens. It was brought up earlier. We probably won't see this happen, but that would be up to upcoming legislators to decide what would be the best direction.
Representative Gomez.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, we could go on like this, but I'll spare us all. So here's the thing, those first two examples that I talked about, the married seniors who are living on their Social Security benefits, who rent their home, who are ineligible in the way that you've described this bill up until this point, the single mom who rents her home, who makes about 40 grand a year and has one kid and has no income tax liability, they pay taxes. We discussed this in tax committee. 25% of our general fund, or of the revenue that we collect in the state of Minnesota, comes via sales taxes. Somebody who pays sales taxes is not eligible for a refund under your bill. My previous understanding up until today, now we're getting some different information, was that anybody who rents is not a property tax payer under House File 4. So these people would get nothing under this bill. But if you're Amazon, or if you're Jeff Bezos and you've sold your up north property, or by the way, if you're a private equity firm that owns commercial property in the state of Minnesota and pays property taxes, if you are an estate, if you are a trust that has an income tax liability in Minnesota, all of those entities would get a tax refund. And the senior couple and the single mom would get nothing. And these aren't like, this isn't just a few people. I just want to be clear. More than 750,000 tax returns that are filed have no individual income tax liability. That's about a quarter of all returns. These people pay taxes, they have no income tax liability on their form, and they're cut out. If we're talking about renters, as Representative Coulter discussed and Representative Howard discussed, it's about a third of Minnesota residents rent. And those people are disproportionately income-limited seniors and people living with disabilities. And so this bill, it cuts out the very lowest income Minnesotans. It cuts out the people who need help the most. Renter, you're out. If you pay sales taxes, it's a quarter of our revenue, you don't get anything. If you're an out-of-state multi-billion-dollar corporation and you pay property taxes in Minnesota, you get a check. A trust fund could get a check out of this. An estate, a giant multi-million-dollar estate, could get a check out of this. A private equity firm that's hollowing out our economy by coming and purchasing long-term care and nursing home facilities, hoping to get rich on the public dime, those guys could get a check from this bill. And you knew this. We've been talking about this bill for weeks. You could have changed it. You didn't change it. You didn't change the language at all to include that senior couple living on Social Security and renting. You didn't change it at all to include the single mom. There's no allowance in here for people who pay sales taxes. And we talked about how we have structured past refunds as sales tax rebates. Jesse checks, they were sales tax rebates. You didn't have to have income tax liability or direct property tax liability in order to get one of those checks. So, I mean, this obviously really ties our hands and constricts our ability to respond to crises. And we don't know what the next shock's gonna be. We know it's gonna come, but we're not sure what it's gonna look like. What this does is it sets the stage for future deficits and for cuts to the services that Minnesotans need, especially those hardest hit by cost increases. The services that they need and count on could be negatively impacted by this. Education, healthcare, social services for elders and people with disabilities, those are the things that we do with our budget. Those are the main things that we buy with our taxes. So what happens if the funding for these critical services disappears? Because we've decided that we want to send it to like a private equity firm in New Jersey and Bezos and a trust fund and a giant estate and this commercial property taxpayer and that one. What happens when funding for those services disappear? Because we've discussed this also in tax committee. I mean, sometimes people in need will go without, but a lot of times, a lot of the things that we buy with our taxes, we are mandated to provide as the government. And so when state funding disappears, the government's obligation to provide the service does not disappear along with it. It just gets passed along. Cities, counties, school districts pick up the slack. And we heard Representative Bakeberg talk about the over-reliance on property taxes to meet our obligations to educate our students. And we've discussed this extensively in the tax committee. That when we don't make hard decisions, we just put it on our local partners. And how do they pay for it? How do cities and counties and school boards pay for their obligations to provide services to Minnesotans? They do it via property tax. They do it via property tax. So it's all fine and good to say that we're like anti-tax, but a lot of times we're just anti-taking the hard vote ourselves because our local partners don't get a choice. The school boards don't get to decide that they have an ideological objection to raising a levy, so they're not going to educate our kids. Cities and counties don't get to decide that they have an ideological opposition to raising taxes, so they're not going to provide emergency services. They're not going to fix roads and bridges. They're not going to, counties are not going to provide the human services that they're mandated by law to provide. That's not how it works. So, this isn't going anywhere. This bill is very ill-conceived, as you may have heard, and it's incredibly unfair. That's the thing that gets me about this. It's like poor design and, kind of all of the sort of changes that have happened and the lack of clarity about what the intent of the bill is. It's that it's incredibly unfair. It picks winners and losers. And it picks as winners the exact people who do not need a hand in this economy. It picks as winners corporations, corporate landowners, private equity, estates and trusts, and it leaves out the 30% of Minnesotans that rent, the 25% of Minnesotans who have no income tax liability, but still pay taxes through sales taxes, through property taxes which are embedded into their rent. And so I would encourage a no vote on this. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Clay, Representative Joy.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Johnson, thank you for bringing this bill. You're giving all of Minnesota a choice when they go to the ballots to vote if they want this or not. Last year, the Democrats voted on a state flag with 14 people and did not have that on the ballot for people to make a choice. 14 people made that decision. This is letting the people of Minnesota make a choice. Thank you for bringing this bill. This is good. Last year, we saw the Democrats spend $18.5 billion surplus, raise taxes $10 billion, and now we're facing a $6 billion deficit. And our governor is out in Nebraska and Iowa waltzing around when we're at a $6 billion deficit. I have a problem. This is where we put it back in, bring it back down here, and we decide what this money's going to do. So with that, I won't keep us too long, but thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Long.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, this bill just doesn't work. Committee after committee and today again on the floor, the author has been unable to answer simple questions about how this bill will actually function. Questions like, how do we ensure our budget meets the needs of Minnesotans if economic conditions worsen? What happens if there is a surplus in the first biennium but projected deficits in the tails? What happens if we have a natural disaster or a new epidemic? What happens if the federal government devastates state funding? And this last one for sure isn't a hypothetical. President Trump is proposing $880 billion in Medicaid cuts, which covers 1 in 4 Minnesotans and 40% of Minnesota kids. Medicaid is 1/6 of our state budget, far
Madam
bigger
Speaker, point
than
of
the
order.
5% buffer that was described in this
State
bill.
your point of order.
How many families would we...
State your point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What is the issue before the body?
I want to remind members that we are on final passage of House File 4. Members, please keep your comments confined to the member or to the bill at hand, which is House File 4. Representative Long.
I sure am, Madam Speaker, and Representative Schultz. I was talking about Medicaid and how Medicaid is a sixth of our budget. And if you'd let me finish my sentence, I was saying that that is far bigger than the 5% buffer that is in this bill. How many families would we have to kick off health care if we had to cover a projected $1.5 billion per year cut in health care coverage for Minnesotans? We asked these questions repeatedly, and all we got were non-answers, because this is not a serious bill. Legislators are elected to make tough decisions, to look at all the facts, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to make informed decisions, not to budget irresponsibly on autopilot. If we had a surplus in the future, we could choose to do ongoing tax breaks, but not under this bill. We could choose to help shore up our schools, our health care, our housing, but not under this bill. We are seeing the impacts of irresponsible trade policy in real time. Markets are coming off a week that saw the S&P 500 enter into correction territory. Meanwhile, the Dow saw its worst weekly performance since 2023 as all major indices lost more than 2%. Inflation is set to surge as the cost of everyday goods rises, reshaping supply chains and hurting Minnesota consumers. Earlier today, the House returned to a 67-67 tie. Committees will now be co-chaired by Democrats and Republicans with equal numbers on members on both parties. Our co-chairs and committee members will use their power to restore a focus on bread and butter economic issues that have been absent these last several weeks. Minnesotans want us to focus on the real issues of fixing our broken economic system, where hardworking people are struggling with rising costs and inflation, and where we are facing real budget threats from Congress and President Trump, not on messaging bills that would handcuff our ability to address very real economic and budget threats. I ask members to reject this bill.
I recognize the member from Anoka, Representative Niska.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Today, we have the opportunity to stand up for the hardworking taxpayers of Minnesota. House File 4 is fundamentally not about picking winners and losers, but about who has the final say on how Minnesotans' hard-earned money is used. Is it the men and women who work tirelessly to provide for their families, laying concrete, harvesting crops, repairing power lines, and stocking grocery shelves? Or is it the politicians in St. Paul who too often are the ones who really pick winners and losers? This is not a theoretical problem. Just 2 years ago, in 2023, Minnesota had a record $18 billion surplus. Despite campaign promises of $2,000 rebate checks to provide much-needed relief for families struggling with record inflation, Democrats made a different choice. Rather than returning the money to the people who earned it, they saw an opportunity to expand government to an unprecedented level. So instead of providing relief, they spent every last penny and then some. While the cost of goods and services soared and Minnesotans struggled to make ends meet, Democrats increased government spending by 40%, from $52 billion to $72 billion in a single budget cycle. Now, because of that irresponsible budgeting, Minnesota is facing a $6 billion budget deficit in a few short years. House File 4 would put an end to this reckless cycle. This bill would propose a constitutional amendment for the 2026 ballot, allowing Minnesotans, not politicians, to decide whether a portion of future surpluses would be returned directly to taxpayers. This measure would ensure that when the state collects more than it needs, a portion of that money goes back to the people who earned it, not just to expanding government picking winners and losers. House File 4 creates a safeguard against runaway spending, ensuring the state lives within its means, just like every Minnesota household does that has to pay those taxes in the first place. The choice before us is clear. Do we trust Minnesotans to make decisions about their own money, or do we continue to let politicians in this chamber spend it for them? House Republicans are here today with a simple message. We believe Minnesotans deserve tax relief. They deserve a say in that tax relief, and we believe it's time to return surplus dollars where they belong, to the hardworking men and women of Minnesota. I urge everyone in this chamber to join with Minnesota Republicans, vote yes on House File 4, and give Minnesotans the power to decide. Thank you.
I recognize the author of the bill, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I'm just going to repeat my closing paragraph that I did on the opening, because I think it really states it the best. Do we stand with the hardworking taxpayers of Minnesota? That's really the question right here. That's the basic question we have right here. Or do we continue to hoard their money while they struggle to make ends meet? Let's do the right thing. Let's let the people of Minnesota know we are listening to them, we care about them, and we believe they know best what to do with their money. Let's not be afraid to ask the constituents if they think this is a good option for them. They will tell us. Let's give that option to Minnesotans. Something they rarely get is that option. Let's pass House File 4 and let the people decide. Thank you. I urge your support. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The clerk will take the roll. The clerk will call the names of the members participating remotely.
Gander.
Go ahead.
Gander votes aye.
Gander votes aye. Kresha.
Go ahead.
Grisha votes aye.
Kresha votes aye.
The clerk will close the roll. There being 67 ayes and 67 nays, the bill does not pass.